Okay, details, often thought as units. This is where all of the inventory is kept, all the details about the inventory is kept, and it is the record of, it's the source record for everything else in the system, right? So this thing drives all the rest of the stuff, all the rest of the views, all the rest of the summary tables, like the IMV sum table, those things get driven off of what's on the inventory detail table. The attributes, part, unit quantity are the most often things that you want to get off of there. Now, we'll talk about this in a bit, but it's important to realize that an inventory detail can be split. It can be split for reasons that are arbitrary as far as you're concerned, but whenever you're looking at inventory, you need to make sure you're going after the sum by part number by like attributes, because we could split it and recombine it in various number of ways depending on how the movements are called. Lot num, rev level, origin code. As I indicated, this system was built in the 90s, in 92, 93 for Compaq. And our first customer, Compaq, had the requirements of status, origin code, rev level, lot number. Now, because of our architecture, because you could just, as far as the user is concerned, those inventory attributes can be anything, right? And they can all be like 20 characters or something. You can use it for anything. Now, could we have gone through and said INV ATR1, INV ATR2, INV ATR3? Yeah, we could have. But there's real questionable ROI for doing that. The amount of work and the amount of bugs that we'd have to track down to do that at this point, considering all the code that's in place. So, frankly, we call them these things internally, but you don't think of them that way. You think of them as new used flag, right? Or, condition code, or, whatever the customer's thinking they need in terms of an attribute. Now, actually, condition code might be a status. But I don't actually like people putting that kind of stuff in the status field if they can avoid it, because I think status is an important thing to say, it's new used. I want to put that in the status because I can just do this. Well, it's new used, and the fact that somebody ran over it with a fork truck, are those mutually exclusive things? It might be new used and destroyed, or new used and damaged. So I think that it's important to make sure that we make the right decision about that. And there's lots of ability to disguise those things as virtually anything. So those other attributes are there for us to use accordingly. Packaging attributes, units per case, pack, and the footprint code. Footprint code allows us to we could set up a default footprint, so case dimensions, size of the pallet stuff, on a SKU by SKU basis. But that is materialized and put forever onto the inventory details, so that if somebody goes and changes the footprint, okay, for other stuff that they're coming in that same footprint code, is that true that we actually just put the footprint code? I thought, I'm just going to take a break here for a second. I thought that we actually put dimensions. Did we materialize the dimensions, or we just put the footprint code on the detail? Okay. So we put the footprint code on the detail so that it's tied to the inventory detail. Again, then the last thing is the important thing here. The really important thing is the connections to the outside world also appear only at the inventory detail level. And the connections to the outside world are the connection to the shipment, if it's connected to a shipment. The receive key that it came in on, if there's a receive key that it came in on, so we can track this all the way through the process, which receive key, which gets us back to the vendor. So for instance, if you're going to do a QA, if we need to QA something, or if something goes on hold, we can actually track this down pretty specifically. Now, I'm not going to say exactly, because if you're not serialized, and we're putting stuff into a location with a bunch of other stuff, we could say, we thought the product was in there, but we have to go and see physically if it's still there, because depending on how the product went in there and came out of there, there might actually be some or not, if you understand my meaning on there. If it's not serialized, we don't know exactly. We can know where we think it might be. We certainly know where we think it might be. We don't know where it is for sure. Workref gets you a connection to the picking structures, and the comp key gets you the key to the outside world from component tracking perspective. So kind of going back to this idea of load sub detail, 3 levels of possible serialization, and I'm not talking about some of the additional serialization stuff that we've added in some of the component serialization stuff, but main levels of just straight inventory serialization. You had load, like a pallet tag, sub, a case number, D, and you could actually have serialized pieces within a serialized case on a serialized pallet. So that's very much the computer manufacturer model, right? You could have 3 different serialized pieces inside a serialized CPU case, and then that's going to be on a pallet with a bunch of other stuff, and they're all going to be uniquely identified. So typically, though, you're going to have 2 or less levels of serialization. You're going to have like a pallet tag, and that's it. You're going to have a pallet tag and a case tag. Or actually, what will happen is, if you got serialized cases, typically you won't even bother putting a pallet tag on the pallet unless you need it for somebody else. Because once you have a serialized box on a case, or a box on a pallet, you know what pallet it's on, and you can identify the pallet by scanning the case. Some things that people have trouble with. Sometimes people want to think about loads as pallets. And I know, because mostly a lot of times it's true. For most cases it's true. If you get into a parts facility that only thinks about things as part quantity, that basically you can identify this by the fact that they got a zillion shelves, right? They got a zillion shelves. Load numbers probably don't have a lot of meaning when they're, the size of the locations like this. The load and the sub now are only meaningful from a bookkeeping perspective. The only thing that's meaningful in there really are the details. And the loads and the subs give you a means to link the details to the location. I really don't think that there's any real reason these days to do permanent non-movable loads. I mean, the one thing that we did at Panasonic was because they had the sheer number of almost 300,000 locations. It was just easy, and all shelf locations, carousel locations. Essentially, all the locations were this big. Back when we did that when we put that in '96, we were really battling that system from a performance perspective. We didn't want to do any inserts or deletes to anything if we didn't need to, so we made a permanent sub and a permanent load and a permanent sub there, so we could only have essentially only moving details around. Unfortunately, the problem is that the detail move is the hardest thing to do. A load move is insignificant. Even if you have to remove the load, it's an insignificant thing. Even a sub-level move's insignificant. The hardest thing to do is a detail move, and that's the problem that you have no matter what. So, having a little bit of an advantage here on the loads and subs really it's not significant with the performance levels that we have. We have other performance issues having to do with big transactions like allocate inventory and things that just by their nature are hard to get around. Moving a pallet and putting a pallet in a location, if you have the right glomming logic attachment strategies set up, it's not going to be a problem. The one thing that I would say is about details. Details are hard to handle. The biggest performance impact we have on moves side of things is on detail moves, when we have to move a detail. Now, it's easy if we're just moving the whole thing. It's trivial, because if you're just moving a whole load, you don't have to do anything with the detail. If you're doing a part quantity transfer, so if you're saying going to the shelf and I'm moving this quantity out there, the detail might have 100 pieces on it, and we're taking 3, right? So not only do we have to split that one detail, we have to create a whole new whole new inventory structure for the outbound side. That's why having this movable permanence is really not a significant thing, because the cost of all this is on the outbound movements anyway, because you have to split the inventory detail, which is kind of a big deal because you have to copy all the attributes, and then you have to make a new inventory sub potentially for it, depending on how you're picking it onto your RF unit, potentially make another load. So when it comes time, moving loads is the easiest thing to do. It's only one update, depending on if it comes from an insignificant or significant area, some other bookkeeping stuff to do. Subs can be just as easy depending on what's going on. Details are the most difficult, and they're frankly not that difficult. It's just a little bit of bookkeeping to do with the quantities and stuff like that. So some words on load sub details. If you start piece picking off of a load and you expect to do case picking and pallet picking off of that, you need to be careful about this. DCS, the discrete product, will assume that you have one broken case on a pallet, right? So if you have if the quantities, units per case, okay, unit quantity divided by units per case comes up with a mod, so it comes up with a remainder, we're going to say, oh, there's one broken case on that. And we know there should only be one open case. And then we're going to be case picking, if you're set up to case pick, we're going to be case picking the heck out of that thing, okay, until we get to that 3 pieces that are left, right? So it's important that, as we tell people, oh, yeah, you can case pick and piece pick, out of the same locations, it's really important to make sure that they understand DCS assumes that we're keeping inventory nicely contained here and we're only opening one box at a time. That's the logic behind the move. So just kind of a question always comes up. What do you scan if anything can be serialized? So we have a STOLOC, a pallet ID, a sub-num, and a detail num potentially. Got serialized things at various levels. Well, we've got this very handy component called Get Translated Inventory Identifier. It's going to figure out what somebody scanned and turned it into the thing that we think it is. So Get Translated Inventory Identifier will take a piece of data and figure out, is it a load number, is it a sub-num, is it a sub-UCC, what level of thing is it? And this is a very handy thing that we use for customizations when we want to add, our own ways of doing scans and things on there. If they want to add, for instance, we've got this, some of the manufacturers are going through this movement to the 2 of 5 labels, and there's some things in there that we're having to do customized for that, to handle that logic if they don't have it actually coming in correctly from all their vendors. So what it does, though, is it looks hierarchically, logically, kind of starting at the top level of the area and then kind of working its way down, looking to see if it can resolve the identifier. Very bad things will happen if we have an identifier that's duplicated at multiple levels. Okay? So here's the thing that happens sometimes. Identify, right? You identify stuff. And let's say they're having to identify serialized product coming in there, and they happen to every once in a while scan the wrong barcode, and they grab an identifier, like they accidentally scan the load number into the sub-number field. Okay, if that actually happens, the identifier will probably work, but the next time somebody needs to go in there and say what's going on with this, at some point, depending on where they are in the process, you may hit an error because it's trying to resolve that identifier, that load number, to both the load and the sub, and not know what's going on, right? So what will happen is, as soon as that box leaves that load, you're in for real trouble, because now we think it's that sub number, which has the same identifier as the load number, is going elsewhere. So as soon as somebody does Get Translated Inventory Identifier, we think we're talking about a load, and you're actually talking about a sub. So a lot of times we will put in a little extra logic if we're scanning serialized things to catch that. In fact, in the part maintenance, there's a way to put in a little check to see if you have serialized product. There's a little chunk of data that you can say, here's kind of the configuration of my serial number. It's got to be these sets of characters in this position. So if they scan this, I know they're scanning a serial number as opposed to a load tag. So that's very handy if you want to catch that. Otherwise, a lot of times we'll put in just a quick little thing to make sure that a sum number or whatever that identifier is, the serialized identifier, looks like a serialized identifier. It's a quick little thing that we can do up front that will solve this problem in the longer term, because if this happens periodically, you get weird inventory issues pop up, and they're hard for our friends over here in the support group to track down. So we highlighted some of the important aspects of the inventory model. We looked at several issues regarding the area setup, important issues there, relationships between the areas, locations, loads, subs, and details. And we looked at ways to do selects against the various tables to get the data back.